in Brazil's financial capital, Sao Paulo. She's going to
because the pandemic is so out of control and the vaccination is running so late, governors and mayors have to push lockdown measures, but they don't have the political strength to do it properly, so the lockdowns come and go. That, of course, affects commerce. We have news now that even industry are halting production. So the economy is really taking a big beat from this pandemic being out of control here.
Is that one of the reasons the government has decided to try to sell off more than 20 airports, 5 ports and a railway line?
They claim one of the reasons is they want to attract private investments to create jobs in Brazil. And these auctions that are happening this week actually are expected to create thousands of jobs. But the thing is, infrastructure project, that's an all-time record in Brazil for unemployment. These jobs, even if they are created, won't respond for the needs of those people who are desperate right now.
What is the government planning to do with the money that it raises from these auctions? Will it go to help some of the many millions of people who are out of work?
Actually, the money that's going to come from the licensing fees is going to be very low. It's something like 642 million reais, which is something little above 80 million pounds. The priority here is to attract private money investments to create jobs. And also we have a law in Brazil that prevents the government from spending more, because we are try to deal with
to create jobs, because there often is a fear when state assets are sold to private buyers that intend to make money out of those assets by reducing costs, reducing the number of workers.
The government's argument is that jobs are going to be created because there is a commitment of these companies that get these projects that are winners in these auctions to invest. We are expecting over 10 billion reais of investments in these projects, which is something like 1.3 billion pounds. The investments are expected to create the jobs.
And when it comes to the economy overall, President Bolsonaro has been against a national lockdown because he believes that would hit the economy. Yet the economy is being hit because the virus is now out of control. Is there any indication that the president may at all change his strategy?
Unfortunately, no. There is no suggestion that Mr. Bolsonaro will change his strategy. He just nominated a new health minister. The minister on his first interview said that the orientation is still not to do a national lockdown. Bolsonaro himself still hasn't been vaccinated, even though he's on the age group that's being vaccinated right now. He still shows up in public without a mask. He's still vocally against lockdown. President Bolsonaro still acts as if it was 2020 and we knew nothing about how to fight this virus.
Thais Carranza there from the BBC in Sao Paulo. Earlier we heard about the situation in India, and we will, of course, keep across what happens there with COVID and the economies in both of those countries. Now, right at the top of the globe, just east of Canada, between the Arctic Circle and the Atlantic Ocean, is, of course, the vast island nation of Greenland. Its population, however, is just 56,000 people. The autonomous territory within Denmark has just voted to change its government, and that could have an impact on the global supply of so-called rare earth metals, which are used in electronics such as smartphone, cars and wind turbines. Why? Because Greenland has large deposits of rare earths. But the incoming government of the left-wing Inuit Ataqatigiit, or the IA party, has said work on a particularly controversial uranium mine in the country's south will now be halted. Bjørn Poppel is a researcher at the University of Greenland in the capital, Nuuk.
Mining as such supported and is considered a part of what would be contributing to the Greenland economy. Where the divide is when it comes to mining of uranium. A mining project in southern Greenland called Greenland contains a huge deposit of rare earth elements, and you can't mine these without having uranium and thorium also as a product. And the election campaign here and the discussions on the election has shown diversities again among the political parties and also supported by the population. 70% of the population is against mining of uranium.
So the IA party, which has emerged as the biggest party after the election, has already said that mining is to be halted at this particular mine. Exactly. What will that decision mean for the government's finances, and also, I suppose, for the mining company that has already invested an awful lot of money in the project?
Yeah, well, you could say that to national finances, it wouldn't mean anything at all for at least two reasons. One reason is that even though the process towards an acceptance of the mine and the production would be as fast as possible, there wouldn't be any income for several years from now. Another thing is, and that's important, and many people do not seem to recognize that, the legal act on self-governance in Greenland states that income from mining, be it royalties or taxes from the companies, should be divided evenly between the Danish state and the Greenland government. It means that when you, for instance, have 1.5 billion Danish kroner in annual income, half of that, 750 million, would be paid to the Danish state and thus reduce the block grant. And then you could say that the 750 million kroner that was left would then have to compensate for the reduced block grant. So for many years and until you get more mining activities contributing, you wouldn't have a net income apart from the income tax from Greenland workers.
We know that about a third of the electorate voted for IA, and you say this was a vote against uranium mining. So a majority of Greenlanders then do support rare earth mining, do they? This was not a vote against mining per se.
No, and that's a very important fact to bear in mind. There is general acceptance of mining under the Conventions that there's something economically for Greenland, and that is from government to state clearly basis for Greenland has not changed. What has been sort of restated is the former policy that there is a zero tolerance towards mining of uranium.
So it may not mean a radical shift in economic policy then, and it may not in any way derail attempts to become completely independent.
I think you're quite right, not a derailing, and also there it's important to remember that almost all the parties are in favor, and a vast majority of the Greenland population, that an independent Greenland is the goal in some kind of future. It's the overall and long-term goal, supposed to be supported by income from mining activities, from fisheries, tourism, and developing of new economic activities.
Was part of the vote against this uranium mine to do with the fact that the company wasn't from Greenland, that it's an Australian company backed by a Chinese firm?
No, more or less everybody an understanding that mining projects are so huge, and you need to have expertise and you need to have the necessary funding. So you couldn't realistically say that they should be Greenlandic companies. That was not a part of it. I guess in the future, for security reasons and stuff, there will be discussions, at least involving the Danish states and the United States, about who are part of, or who are the shareholders behind the different companies. And especially, of course, when there's a Chinese company involved, that will especially mean that attention will be focused on that.
Bjørn Poppel there, who is a researcher at the University of Greenland, speaking to Rob Young about the new government and the impact that will have on rare earth metal mining in Greenland. Business Matters coming up shortly. Plenty we'll be discussing there, continuing our conversation about the COVID situation in India and Brazil. We'll also be talking about dating apps and how they're doing. But that is it for this edition of World Business Report.
You're listening to the BBC World Service, where Anna Foster looks at the efforts to rebuild a destroyed city.
In 2017, Islamic State group fighters captured Marawi. Nearly 5 years on, I'm in the Philippines to see how the destruction is still affecting people today. And I'll explore the ways future extremism is being prevented, both in schools and prisons.
The Other Caliphate, Saturday at 11 and Sunday at 2 GMT. And at bbcworldservice.com, witness history.
We hear about the early years of natural history broadcasting. In the mid-1950s, the BBC broadcast a new television programme in Britain called Zoo Quest. It launched the career of a man who has since brought the natural world into millions of homes around the world. The naturalist and broadcaster, Sir David Attenborough.
This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Coming up after the news, it's this month's World Book Club, and today we're talking with the award-winning Austrian author Robert Seethaler about his haunting novel A Whole Life. Spanning much of the 20th century and told with a graceful simplicity that belies the harshness of much of the story, Robert Seethaler's A Whole Life tells of one man's relationship with an ancient landscape. Andreas Egger knows every nook and cranny of the alpine mountain valley that's his home, and from which vantage point he witnesses the arrival of the modern world, its technologies, its commerce, its wars. A stark yet tender book about love, loss, endurance, and finding dignity and beauty in solitude, A Whole Life has already touched over 1 million readers with the power of its honesty and solace. Find out more in World Book Club with Robert Seethaler, me, Harriet Gilbert, and readers from all around the world after the news.
BBC News, I'm John Shea. Myanmar's ambassador in London, Jaws Wah Min, says he's been locked out of the embassy because of his opposition to the military coup in his country 2 months ago. Paul Adams is outside the embassy in Mayfair.
Myanmar's envoy says his embassy has been taken over by the military. He calls this a coup. Jaws Wah Min says he was locked out of the building this evening by the embassy's military attaché. He's tried a couple of times to get in, watched by the police and a small group of pro-democracy activists, but so far without success. The ambassador has been critical of the military's actions in Myanmar. He's called for restraint and for the release of the country's elected de facto leader, Aung San Suu Kyi. The military did say he was being recalled a month ago after the ambassador made what they said was an unauthorized statement.
The US has announced that it will provide the Palestinians with more than $230 million in aid, resuming funding that was halted by the Trump administration. The State Department spokesman, Ned Price, said that helping the Palestinians served America's interests and provided relief to people in great need.
This is consistent with who we are as a people. It also happens to be consistent with what is in our interests. And when we talk about the humanitarian funding that we have announced today, it is to alleviate in many cases, the humanitarian suffering that Palestinians have endured, whether it is in the West Bank, whether it's in Gaza, or whether it's in the broader region.
The chief prosecution investigator at the trial of a former US policeman over the death of Mr. Floyd could be heard on footage from the scene saying, "I ate too many drugs." But Mr. Reyerson was then asked to view the footage again. Gary O'Donoghue explains.
Mr. Reyerson was asked by state lawyers to watch a longer excerpt containing the same passage. He then agreed with prosecutors that Mr. Floyd had said something like, "I ain't do no drugs." It's a central part of the defence case that fentanyl and methamphetamine found in Mr. Floyd's body contributed to his death, and that the main cause was not the more than 9 minutes Derek Chauvin spent kneeling on him.
A Turkish court has sentenced 32 former soldiers to life imprisonment for their part in the failed coup of 2016, in the culmination of a trial centred on the Presidential Guard. Prominent among them were two officers who led the storming of the state television station TRT and forced the presenter to read out their manifesto. The government blames the plot on Fethullah Gulen, a former ally of President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who's been living in the United States since they fell out. This is the latest world news from the BBC. European and British medical regulators have issued precautionary advice about the AstraZeneca coronavirus vaccine, with both stressing that the benefits outweigh the risks. The European Medicines Agency said that unusual blood clots should be listed as a very rare possible side effect. Britain is to offer alternative vaccines to people under the age of 30. The British government says it will provide targeted help to the hundreds of thousands of Hong Kong citizens who are expected to move to the UK using a special visa. Ministers have promised support with housing, schools and jobs for immigrants who arrive from the former British territory. The Chinese government has introduced a security law there which restricts long-standing democratic freedoms. Britain's Prime Minister Boris Johnson has said he's deeply concerned by violence in Northern Ireland, which has been going on for the past few nights. In the latest incident, police came under attack and a bus was hijacked and set alight in the main city, Belfast. The violence began over local political issues and concerns about the impact on Northern Ireland of Brexit. Police in California say the golfer Tiger Woods was driving at nearly double the speed limit before a crash that left him seriously injured. The Los Angeles County Sheriff said Woods' car had been travelling at more than the equivalent of 130 kilometres an hour when it careered off the road in February.
The primary causal factor for this traffic collision was driving at a speed unsafe for the road conditions and the inability to negotiate the curve of the roadway. Estimated speeds at the first area of impact were 84 to 87 miles per hour, and the final estimated speed when the vehicle struck the tree was 75 miles per hour. There were no citations issued, and there are no signs of impairment.
Woods needed surgery after the accident to repair his shattered right leg and ankle. And that's the latest BBC World News.
Hello, this is the BBC World Service. I'm Harriet Gilbert. Welcome to World Book Club. This month's novel has been variously described as, I quote, a slim masterpiece, deeply moving, heart-rending and heart-warming. Called A Whole Life. It sold more than 1.5 million copies around the world. And joining us now to answer questions about it is its Austrian author, Robert Seethaler. Robert, welcome to World Book Club.
Hello.
Hello. You're Austrian, but I'm right. You live in Germany, in Berlin. That's it, isn't it?
Yeah, I was born in Vienna, but I moved to Germany because I've got a little son. He's 11 years old. He's in Berliner. So if my son is a Berliner, I'm a Berliner.
Lovely. And Robert Seethaler's got two countries then and two careers. Besides being a writer, he's an actor, appearing in numerous TV dramas and in movies such as Paolo Sorrentino's Youth. Of his 7 novels, probably the best known internationally are The Tobacconist, The Field, and the one we're talking about today, A Whole Life, which was voted Book of the Year by German booksellers when it came out and went on to be shortlisted for the International Dublin Literary Award and the International Booker Prize. As its title suggests, it's the apparently simple story of one man's life. He's called Andreas Egger, and we first meet him as a small child in 1902. His mother's just died, and he's been sent to live at the farm of his violent, abusive uncle Kranstocker. The farm's in a valley in the Austrian Alps, an area both dangerous and beautiful. And as Andreas grows up, his life in the mountains is marked by danger and beauty in many forms. He gets work helping to build cable cars, scrambling up rocks to drill holes for dynamite. He falls in love. He marries. He's confronted by tragedy, war, and the failures of old age. And I could say that's it, that's the story, except that this novel does so much more than tell a story. It reverberates with questions about human dignity, about what's needed for a full life, about the meaning of home, about love. And I think we should now hear a reading from it in the English translation by Charlotte Collins. Here he is, the modest hero of a whole life, who I should say has got a limp because his uncle once beat him so savagely that he smashed one of his legs.
Andreas Egger was considered a cripple, but he was strong. He was a good worker, didn't ask for much, barely spoke, and tolerated the heat of the sun in the fields as well as the biting cold in the forest. He took on any kind of work and did it reliably and without grumbling. He was as good with a scythe as he was with a pitchfork. He turned the freshly mown grass, loaded dung onto carts, and lugged rocks and sheaves of straw from the fields. He crawled over the soil like a beetle and climbed between rocks to retrieve lost cattle. He knew in which direction to chop different kinds of wood, how to wedge, hone the saw, and sharpen the axe. He seldom went to the inn, and he never allowed himself more than a meal and a glass of beer or krautere. He scarcely spent a single night in a bed. Usually, he slept on hay, in attics, in small side rooms, and in barns alongside the cattle. Sometimes, on mild summer nights, he would spread a blanket somewhere on a freshly mown meadow, lie on his back, and look up at the starry sky. Then he would think about his future, which extended infinitely before him, precisely because he expected nothing of it. And sometimes, if he lay there long enough, he had the impression that beneath his back, the earth was softly rising and falling. And in moments like these, he knew that the mountains breathed.
Well, an excerpt from Robert Seethaler's A Whole Life. And our first question for you, Robert, now, it comes from Nanchital in Mexico. It was rung into the program by Nanche Cortizo, and here he is to ask it.
Dear Robert, I'm Nanche Curtido. Greetings from Nanchital, Mexico. First of all, thanks. Your book made a huge difference in my life while I was going through a rough time, struggling with a sudden personal loss and midlife crisis. It helped me to realize that all those little things that accumulate with time elapsing is what really matters. Finding dignity in his own, without external validation. So my question is about the inspiration for the main character. It was someone in particular or a combination of people that you came across during a whole life? Thank you.
So, Robert, was Andreas inspired by a particular person or just a combination of people you've met?
It was a combination of all my experiences, of all the people I ever met. Of course, I invented him. I invented everything. I made up all the places, all the names in this book. So you can say it's a combination of my memories or even of my emotional memories. Yes.
And what in particular were you thinking about when you were creating this sort of character?
I just like him because I understand him, not in an intellectual way, but with the heart. In fact, this Andreas Egger is a part of me. I wrote him out of my heart. And he has a handicap. He limps. And this is my own experience, my own life experience. I had a handicap as well.
Well, we have another question about Andreas now. This one comes from Cape Town in South Africa, where Nat Stone lives, and he emailed the programme to ask this. Well, first of all, what he says is, what an illuminating, flesh-off-the-bones, enraptured read. But he has a question as well. He says, in giving Andreas a physical handicap, you endear him to us. You make us care for him more. Why was that important?
Yeah, as I told you before, it's my own experience. For me, I see very poorly, so I've got problems with my eyes, and when I was a child, I was in the school for blind. So, but this is a handicap that has brought me a long way. When I close my eyes, I see better. And handicap is always a chance as well. And Andreas is just limping. It's not that bad. Some limp, the others squint. The others were shot off with both arms, but all are alive. And the question is, what would we be without our scars?
Robert Seethaler, thank you very much indeed. I'm still in Africa. This question comes from Lilongwe in Malawi, and it was sent in by Orama, who emailed this. He said, thinking about Andreas's uncle, how important is the theme of abuse in this novel?
Okay, it is important, but it's not a story about abuse. Abuse is part of Andreas' life. It's part of many lives, I think, but it was not really the focus. It was part of his life, a small part, and it became bigger with the years, but it's not a book about abuse.
Well, thank you very much for that. We have another question about Andreas now. This comes from Vilnius in Lithuania, Kotryna Stadkuta. And Kotryna, you're on the telephone. Hello.
Hello.
Would you like to ask your question of Robert?
Yeah, sure. So hello, Robert. My name is Kotryna Stadkuta, and I'm from Vilnius in Lithuania. And A Whole Life was my first book of yours, and it was a great pleasure to read it. That slow and simple way of living really got me thinking about my own life. So I really want to say a huge thank you for this experience while reading your book.
Thank you for reading my book.
Yeah, thank you for writing it. And my question here is, so why did you choose to write about an ordinary person such as Egger and his simple and slow way of living? Because nowadays literature is usually full of different characters, emotions, and events, and you chose to write about an ordinary person and his simple life. Why?
Ordinary life is also life, and everything is interesting if you look at it long enough or from the right angle. Every moment on this earth is something special, a very special little sensation. I like to keep it simple, and a simple life is a full life. This was my interest in this story.
Yeah, so do you think that that simple way of living maybe is the key to real happiness?
I wish I had the key to happiness. I don't have it. It was not just really a simple life, it was a hard life. He seems to be at peace with himself and the world at the end of his life. But still he fought and suffered and struggled. Andreas is just a hero, as most people who get to know illness, loss, pain and death. So I don't know, I think every person has to find his very special own key to happiness. I wish you luck to find it.
Well, and thank you for your answer.
Yeah, thank you for your question.
Kotryna, thank you very much. And we have a caller now who's on the phone in London. She's Mavis Alagar. Mavis, hello.
Hi.
Hello, Robert. I'm so thrilled and delighted to be able to speak to you. I was passionately absorbed with the book and found it absolutely beautiful. A story describing adversity and contentment in such a short book. This is a book I will read again and again whenever I'm overcome by adversity, which all of us have encountered pretty often during this unusually sad year. So I started reading it on a Friday afternoon and finished it by midnight. But I woke up at 4 a.m. with one clear question for you. And I emailed it immediately to the BBC at 4 a.m, lest I forget. Ege has overcome every adversity in his life. He has also experienced the love of Marie and her tragic end. You gave the reader the feeling that no matter what life throws at you, everything is possible. Did you feel a sense of pride that you had achieved this in such a short book?
Oh, I'm sorry, because I never feel pride. I'm never proud. It's just work. I'm working, but I'm quite satisfied with the book. But I'm really touched from your words, yeah, because obviously you are touched by the book, and more I couldn't ask for. So thank you very much. It's your book. It's the reader's book. Every reader reads their own book.
Yes, it's one that will stay with me for a very long time, and I thank you very much for that.
Mavis, thank you very much for your question. And It's interesting because Mavis refers to your hero as Egger. Other people call him Andreas. I notice that you call him by both names at the beginning of the novel. He's Andreas Egger. And towards the end of the novel again, you talk about him as Andreas Egger. In the middle, you only ever call him Egger. Is this something that you did deliberately?
No, I don't do many things consciously. I just do it without thinking of it, and if it makes sense at the end, I'm happy.
Well, it certainly made sense to me. And Mavis mentioned there, Marie, the love of Andreas's life. And let's have another reading now. This is during Andreas's courtship of Marie, or it might be more precise to say it's during Marie's courtship of Andreas. Anyway, here the two of them are. They're out walking in the mountains.
As they descended the narrow winding path to the valley, Egger fell silent again. He felt strange and a little embarrassed, without knowing why. They stopped for a while at a bend in the path, sat in the grass and leaned their backs against the trunk of a fallen beech. The wood had stored the warmth of the last days of summer and smelled of dry moss and resin. All around them, the mountain tops rose up into the clear sky. Marie thought they looked as if they were made of porcelain, and although Egger had never seen porcelain in his life, he agreed with her. He'd have to be careful walking there, he said. One false step and the whole landscape might crack or shatter straight away into thousands of tiny landscape splinters. Marie laughed. That sounds funny, she said. Yes, said Egger, then bowed his head, not knowing what to do next. He would have liked to stand up, grab a rock, and fling it somewhere at random, as high and as far as possible. Suddenly he felt her shoulder against his shoulder. He raised his head and said, I can't stand it any longer. He turned towards her, took her face in both hands, and kissed her. Goodness, she said. Aren't you strong? Sorry, he said, alarmed, and drew back his hands. It was nice, though, she said. Even though it hurt? Yes, she said. Very nice. He took her face in his hands once more, this time as gently as you would cradle a hen's egg or a newly hatched chick. That's right, she said, and closed her eyes.
From Robert Seethaler's A Whole Life. Robert, we have a question for you now, which was emailed from the Netherlands, from Groningen, by Perry Hoekstra. And this is what he had to ask you. He said, I really loved reading A Whole Life. It was a touching, beautifully written story. And then in brackets, I read it in German. Although, he says, we skim over Andreas's thoughts, we don't spend a long time going deeply into them. Still, as a reader, you feel what he feels. You still empathise with him. How do you explain that? And I think it's true, is it not, Robert? I mean, we don't get pages of his philosophical musings as you might with some characters, but you do get a great sense of him nonetheless.
I'm really touched because of these questions. What I learn now is that the readers read their own book. I love Andreas Egger. I wrote this character out of my heart, and maybe that's what the people appreciate with this book. Of course, this character is made up of my experiences. So, is this an answer? I don't know. Are you satisfied with my answers?
I think it's definitely an answer. Thank you very much indeed. And we've got a